Page is long. Wait, why did you just... Oh, okay. Just slid down a little bit. We're okay. But if you would, we are in Acts chapter 20. And just to kind of recap and bring us back to where we are in the journey, if you remember, first off, Troas was where Paul was when he first got the Macedonian call. And he had gone off and he'd gone over there, but what you see in the beginning of chapter 20, which we're not going to read 1 through 6, but Luke just kind of summarizes some of the things that were happening which kind of pushed them out. If you remember last week when we were talking about his journey, what ended up happening was kind of like the silversmiths, the blacksmiths, whoever was all involved in making statues and things for the false gods, they got together because their livelihood was being hurt and caused a ruckus. And basically then it brought in the Romans to come in and say, well, you guys might get in trouble if you don't disperse because we'll call this an illegal meeting. And obviously at this point, Paul doesn't seem to run away from authority. He doesn't seem to run, but he does listen to the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit directs him, hey, it's time to move on. He had spent some time there, 2 or 3 years teaching, and I'm sure there were a lot of converts that we see. But then that leads him on his journey back. He's actually going to be working pretty soon on heading back to Jerusalem. And, that's where things are just not going to turn right. He's going to get arrested. He's going to get taken to Rome, and which would lead us into, as some would categorize that last portion, since he's already doing these missionaries, some will classify the arrest as a fourth journey because, let's face it, even under house arrest, he was writing letters, he was still encouraging people, he was still working, and not to mention people were coming to see him that he was teaching when he was there. But he goes down to Troas, and this is an interesting little section here. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul began talking to them, intending to leave the next day. And he prolonged his message until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered together. And there was a young man named Eutychus sitting on the windowsill, sinking into a deep sleep. And as Paul kept on talking, he was overcome by sleep and fell from the third floor and was picked up dead. But Paul went down and fell upon him, and after embracing him, he said, "Do not be troubled, for his life is in him." When he had gone back up and had broken the bread and eaten, he talked with them a long while until daybreak, and then left. They took away the boy alive and were greatly comforted. All right, so we have a couple of things that I see going on here in this passage. First off, it makes a reference to the first day of the week. And also, if you notice, there's breaking of bread is used twice in this section. And really, if you look at the context, now, don't get me wrong, first century Jews daily met with one another and ate food together. They would study together, they would do those things, but we need to realize that sometimes in the Bible, breaking of bread is a reference to communion. And I think the very beginning part of this, when I'm looking at this, on the first day of the week, when we were gathered together, why were they gathered together? To break bread. There's an emphasis there as to the point that this is the first day of the week and this is when we do this. It's the first day of the week when we gathered together to break bread. So I see a reference in here, and this is where a lot of us get the idea of, why do we take communion on a weekly basis? This is one of the reference points that we look at as far as that goes. The fact that here we have Paul, and they're making an emphasis here. On the first day of the week, but actually, does someone have their Bible? I don't have the passage open. I just have my text. Someone read me verse 6, I think, if I'm... Okay, yeah. So he's saying where he went. They had run from the trouble, but now they're here. He's staying there for 7 days. is how long he's going to stay there. And we see the emphasis here in the beginning of, the time that they take to partake of the bread. Now, I want to emphasize later, because I did not read down further than that, and actually, I think we're going to be skipping. Yeah, the little section in there after the incident here with Eutychus falling and the miracle, where it talks about, well, actually it was in the passage, I'm sorry. It talks about Paul then breaking bread again. But if you see that, it's a different type of bread. They weren't just setting aside to do that. That seemed like more the idea of eating a meal there. Yes, Kristen. Yeah. Well, to be honest with you, there's not an actual verse that comes out somewhere and says communion is to be taken on the first day of the week. Matter of fact, Jesus, when he gave the beginning of the Passover and he explained to them what it was, he says, as often as you take this. Now, could that be interpreted that there could be other times that we could take it? I think it can be, but I also think we got to be careful in those situations, because there are religions that claim to be Christians that will take it because of weddings, because of funerals, because of any time that they meet. Why? What is the point of that? Why did they decide to do that? Now, my look at this is, here we actually have an example of them, and Paul is actually making Luke is making the statement here, but he's talking about what Paul is saying, and he's emphasizing the fact that it was because on the first day that's when they were going to break bread. That's why he stayed another day. And then we see him once they do break bread. Now, we've had people, or at least I've had people, throw an issue about when to take the communion, as far as in the service. And to be honest with you, at Lake Milton, we ended up switching it just because we just didn't want to fight with the person anymore. They thought that, you looked at this, he took the communion, and then Paul preached. And that was his emphasis. And he was really, it was stuck in his mind. And then I found out the reason, they were taking communion after the sermon. And years before I was there, when there was an eldership there, the elders had changed that simply because people were leaving after the sermon. And they would take communion before. And so they were just doing that in a way. So there's no particular, as far as service goes. But this is one of the only places that we have that really does talk about. You can look at 1 Corinthians there, but it really doesn't say. Sure. Yeah. Well, what would I say to that person? I would say, well, here we have an example of the first century, which is who we're supposed to follow, and it's the emphasis there that it's the first day of the week, and that's why they're meeting. Yes, I know, and to be quite honest with you, and I know I got some hands, and I'll get to you guys. I'd be quite honest with you. I personally couldn't throw out if you're not taking it every Sunday, say that you're doing wrong. Just because I can't see a passage that says that says this is a command to do it this way, and especially with what Jesus said. Now, I look at it from the perspective, here we have an example. What would be the reason that they would take of it every week? Well, what is the communion for? No, we're supposed to fill our bellies, right? To remember Jesus, right? So you got to be careful spreading that out too. Now, I'm also not giving you a book, chapter, verse and saying, and that's why I say, but in my case, when I have an example of them doing it, I would rather follow that example and be safe than to do it once a month or once a year or annually and not. But I really can't point out another passage that sticks to this and says first day of the week is when you take communion. Eric and then Jamel.
Yeah, and I know some people look at that 7 days and say, he's waiting all that time. But there is another explanation that people don't think about, that he's traveling on a ship.
Yeah, he could have been waiting for.
Cargo ship. It may take them a week to load or to unload. They may be waiting for the winds to shift. So this is not like you got to jump on an airplane and go somewhere. You got to wait for it.
Well, and even an airplane though, it's scheduled. It's just not as far out.
You're not restricted to wind.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sailboat. Yes, I see what you're saying. Jamel. Yeah. Yeah, right, yeah. To the point where someone fell asleep and fell out the window, right? Yeah. But, you know, and that's the thing, you know, that was one of those things right there, and this is along the subject, that was one of those things where, as the men of the congregation, we decided this wasn't changed for a doctrinal reason. So if it's bothering somebody, we're just going to go ahead and switch it to before the sermon. And that was really our thinking behind that there, you know. But you're right, you know, sometimes we grab a hold of things and we don't read the whole passage. You know, how many people would complain if I preached for 2 hours? You know, let alone till midnight. So, yes, Leslie. Yeah, it's too hard. Let's just forget about that. No matter how important it is, right? Yeah, and that is somewhat of the mentality. I don't know. I can tell you this, that you can go back in history and you can read now. I don't preach that you follow history and do with that, but you can still see examples of people writing about the church up around the 1st century, and they're saying these people who called themselves, so it's not someone who's a Christian. He's like, this group of people, where they'll start out that way, had a habit of meeting early in the morning on Sunday. Now, here's the reason they met early, though. It wasn't because they were early birds and they needed to go. The problem was Sunday was a work day. Sunday was, it's not, the weekday schedule wasn't the same as ours. You know, Saturday, well, some people might have been working 7 days. But if you were going to have a day off in those days, it was more than likely a Saturday and not Sunday. So they would write about this and say they met, and there were many of them that said that they did it also to take the communion. You know, so we can look back at and see that, but I couldn't put stock and say a bunch of historians said this, so we're going to follow it. But I do see an example and a connection here. Eric?
Is that there are people that I've heard some people say that taking it weekly makes
Too much?
loses its significance, and to which I would say, why don't you just eat your meal once a month?
Right.
It's like, would eating only once a day make it feel more significant? No, nobody's going to really do that, but it's an excuse.
Well, you know what? Things do tend to taste better when you're really hungry, though. So you could win the argument that way, but no, it's the emphasis is if we're meeting on the first day of the week to worship God and to remember His Son that died on the cross, why would we want to exclude that? I mean, unless there was a command in there that said, do not take this every week, because that's where Eric was going, because now you're doing it too much and it's going to lose its flavor and it won't be any good. But you know what? That's not it, because if you come to worship God and your heart is there as a Christian, it's not going to matter if you do it every day or not. Well, actually, it probably would matter if you don't do it every day, because then you're going to lose that. If you don't continue to remind yourself of God, this world is going to yell so loud, and they're going to try to get you to to not hear it. I was listening to a video the other day, and this guy was talking, and I didn't even catch his name yet, but he was talking, and the girl had said to him in the interview, she says, "You seem to be one of the most loved and most loathed persons in America right now." You know, and really he's a conservative standing person. He speaks against, you know, especially the one video I saw where he's just so against this idea of transgender under 18. You know, he's saying you want to be an adult and make a decision, that's fine. But he was saying stuff like, well, why don't we make it a possibility for those children to be able to come back when they're adults and sue? Because that's what our country does. We've made laws about things like that. Well, if this doesn't work, you come back and you sue them later. But anyhow, what he was saying was, he said, you know, it's not so much that there's a huge crowd of people that loathe me. He says, it's just they're the loudest. And that's it. I mean, a lot of times as Christians, we feel like we're and don't get me wrong, the Bible tells us we're the minority in a lot of cases. But sometimes I think we have that, I don't know, come to Jesus. We need to have that come to Jesus moment that Isaiah had when he's huddling down, afraid of the enemy coming and attacking him. And God says, hey, let me show you what you can't see. And he shows them the army of angels that God had that's there to protect him. That he couldn't see it at the point, and he felt like he was alone. And I'm just pointing that out, that sometimes we got to be careful with that. And I know I kind of went off the subject here a little bit, but we do need to look at that and make sure that we're not, letting someone who's just being loud make us feel like that's what the entire world says. And that's the thing, because I'll tell you what, it seems to be that way. I'm not saying there isn't some loud Christians out there. And I'm not saying that there isn't Christians that will stand their ground and be faithful to God. But it does seem like our opposition seems to be a lot louder than us. And I think we need to look at that and realize that just because they're louder doesn't mean we need to write the world off. I mean, how many times I've looked at things and thought, this world's just falling apart. And then I thought, you know what? I don't know what God knows. I don't know the hearts of man. Now, I look around in my society and I look at the news and I look at all the things that are happening and I say, that's negative. People are dying. People are, because of this or that, the stupid mass shootings that for some reason people are doing in our country and whatever the cause is that might be. But, we see all of these things happening, and I think sometimes we feel as if we're alone because of that, maybe. And I think we just need to realize sometimes that maybe the other crowd's just louder. Doesn't mean they're necessarily bigger at this point. Now, I'm not telling you that God's not looking at the earth right now and saying they got 24 hours because they're so far gone. I don't know. But I do look at that kind of thing and I think, man, we don't know the hearts of everybody. We just see some of the negative things that seem to be on the top of the news reports and things. And I will say this, I think our country is going further and further away from Christianity. But that's not to say there isn't groups out there that are not in our country that are thriving as Christians. And there are also Christianity in the United States that is thriving in some areas. Yes? Yeah, right. Absolutely. And we got to be careful writing the world off. and just saying it is, it's so horrible and it's so bad. And it is. There's bad things in the world. But that doesn't mean, I honestly think if we get to the point where it's so bad, that's when God's going to come get us. But the thing is, are we even going to know that? And another thing, they may be loud and we may be in the minority, but we need to remember that even if we're in the minority, we have the most powerful. And that's obviously God to protect us, to get us through this life. All right, so I don't know if we answered the communion question because we went kind of somewhere else, but really what I can say is, we can see here in this passage there is an example of this happening. You can look back in history and you can see, and I'm talking not 400, 500, 600 years after Christ died. I'm talking 100 years after. Josephus was another one that, you can go read about him, and he doesn't seem to even be a follower of Jesus. He was just a Jewish guy that actually was born like about a year after Jesus. But he wrote all about him, saying the miracles that he had performed and things like that, but kind of stopped short of calling him the Son of God or the Messiah. But there were, it was recognized that Jesus did these things. So how do you preach a sermon that's so boring that you have someone fall out the window? Now, obviously, what's that? You sit down for a long period of time and just listen to somebody. It's going to make you tired, no matter what. And you hear this. Paul preached for 20 minutes, right? Yeah. And you know what? And then it seemed like after he was done, after the kid fell out the window, and he saved him, he came up, he got a bite to eat, and then they sat and talked again for the rest of the night. We get Ryan and then Cindy. So almost kind of like a little kid that doesn't want to go to sleep. He's supposed to, but there's something that's catching his eye that he really, really wants. Cindy? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, but really, I think probably one of the more important things is the fact that they wanted the word so much they were willing to sit there and listen and stay there. And then, Eutychus falls out the window. I don't know about you, but we're probably talking about a 30-foot drop. They said it was up on the 3rd story. Now, they said the room was well lit. So it wasn't like it was, you would think in the 1st century you could possibly be in a building when it's dark, and it could be pretty drab and dark if there isn't enough candles or torches or lamps, gas lamps that is. But it's well lit. And, obviously it seems Luke just kind of gradually, it's not gradually, he kind of just talks about this like it's a normal event. Eutychus fell out the window. Everyone thought he was dead. Paul comes down. He embraces him, says some words. And he says, don't worry. His words were, don't worry, his life's not gone. He was dead. Mark as much said he died. So there was a miracle that happened once again. But you see that happening, and you see the people, they wanted more. And we need to be like that. We need to have that attitude. And I'm not saying we just need to have an attitude where I need to go to church because I want to learn. Well, add to that, I need to study my Bible daily. I need to read daily. I need to convene with God as much as I possibly can. Now, we do also see coming up, and this will be our breaking point. Obviously, I didn't even get past one page on my notes, and that's why I said I didn't guarantee we were going to be done, but I thought we might. But anyhow, in 20 verse 16, one of the things that we learn, and this will just kind of be where we stop, and we'll pick up in Acts 20 verse 17 starting next week, but we learn that Paul's goal is to be back in Jerusalem for the day of Pentecost, a journey that will eventually bring him much suffering. Once in Miletus, Paul summons the elders from Ephesus to come and meet with him to discuss several important issues. Now, remember, Paul had a very strong connection with Ephesus. And you know what Paul's basically doing? Paul's basically saying goodbye. He's basically telling you, it doesn't say that in there. He doesn't say, I'm never coming back. But he's basically pulling the elders from this congregation together, and number one, he wants to encourage them to continue to stay faithful to God, to continue to follow the doctrines of God, because then he even goes into telling them that they need to beware, that there's going to become false teachers that are going to come in, and he's telling these elders of the church in Ephesus, he's saying, it is your duty to keep this congregation safe. And that's kind of along the lines, but I really think, when we get into that, it's not so much Paul's pulling these gentlemen aside and ridiculing them and saying, you guys need to do better, or, step up your game. It's a loving brother who's coming to these elders. Here's an apostle in Christ, and he just wants to encourage them. He wants to encourage them to keep doing what they're doing. Continue to teach the Word of God, not to let anyone change it. All right. Any other questions or comments at this point? Okay. All right. As I said, we'll pick up in Acts 20, verse 17. We offer the invitation at this point, if there's anyone here that has any need, whether to be baptized into Christ, or maybe you need prayers of encouragement, or you just need to come forward so that we can pray for you in any way. Yeah, go ahead. Well, I mean, obviously we can't look at that passage or any other and say here's a deadline of when it's going to happen. And that particular passage I'd have to read through again because I don't remember it off the top of my head. But I would say this in the New Testament, as far as that goes, what Jesus says is, hey, it's going to be like in the days of Noah. And that's not talking about the fact that they're going to just be wicked. I think that is the case. That the people in Noah's age were wicked, and that's why he destroyed the earth. But what they were doing, continuing to marry, continuing to live their life, they were just going through the flow of life, and they weren't thinking of God. And that's what's going to happen. You're right. When the God's people are completely crippled down here, it's not that God's crippled, it's just that maybe there's no one else left to turn to him. And all the souls have gone home, or maybe there will only be 8. But it does, or go ahead, Jamal, you had another comment too. Yeah. Yeah, which that one right there makes the subject of the Godhead even harder to understand. That they're all one, the same, but yet, Jesus separated himself from heaven and came down here. And you're right, he said, not even I, only the Father knows. But And I think that's one last thing we got to be careful with, because sometimes we also look at this world and say, oh, God's coming soon because look how horrible it is. But God's going to wait to the very last minute, because if not, do you think maybe he would have came a few generations before Noah and maybe took some more of the family, because I do. But God waited until it was the final number that he could use. Eric?
Sometimes we really can't judge that either, because look at Elijah. He thought he was the only one left.
Yeah, right.
God says, how many? 7,000? They didn't know about that 7,000.
Right.
So we might be looking at the world thinking, well, this place is good, but there could be millions
Yeah.
out there.
Right. And that's absolutely it. I mean, the one thing we got to remember is God's grace. God's going to take as many to heaven as he can. He has as much told us that. That's what he wants. Sarah? Oh. Yeah. And that's an unfortunate thing that we look at too. We sometimes, and don't get me wrong, you look at souls that are lost and things along that line. But, we just tend to, we concentrate so much on the negative things that are around us in this world that we look at it and say, it's so horrible, it's gone. But yet, just like, we don't know. And you're absolutely right. There are some bigger congregations down south. I mean, just the congregation alone that Courtney's been going to in Florida. We were down there, or I was down there once anyways, and it's just awesome to see that many people on a Sunday morning come together. But what I was trying to get at was, we need to stop looking at numbers and saying that's the only thing that says we're being successful. Now, don't get me wrong. If we're losing people and people are going out the door and saying you're doing something wrong, or if we're not converting people. But I think sometimes we forget that, we could pray as hard as we want to God. But if somebody's not willing to accept the word of God when you take it to them, God can't make them. And, so we just need to realize, hey, let's be more positive, right? And the sun just started shining as soon as I said that. So, I mean, if that wasn't a sign right there, I'll tell you, you got to also, I'll say one last thing for the 37th time. I heard something today from somebody that just, is an encouraging, it was just an encouraging statement. Someone made the comment to me that they had been praying and praying and praying, and something had come up that just answered their prayer. And it was just the picture of that in their heart was, I knew God was listening. And, it was just that type of thing where it's just, when someone sees that, and, I'm not talking about someone who is a new Christian or someone who hasn't been a Christian. The person I'm talking about has been a Christian for years. But it's just that idea that the more of those little things that we do, I mean, that's somewhat the most important thing, is getting our soul right here first. Because if we're not right, it doesn't matter how many people we teach the gospel to. They may find salvation, but what do we do for ourselves? And that's not taking away from being humble as a Christian. It's just where you have to start. So at this time, if there is anyone that has any need or needs prayers, please come forward as we stand and sing this song.